Vol verwachting klopt ons hart. But I think I'll have to continue in English. It's lovely to be here in this very well-known university for the first time in South Africa, and to see so many of you come, which of course shows to me, as I see all over the world, there is enormous interest in the God question and the science question. I've just returned from visiting 6 Ivy League universities, in each case over 1,000 people turning up, because God has been put very much on the agenda in a negative way by the attacks on God in the name of science. And that has resulted in the widespread impression that science and God are on a collision course. I refute that, and I think it's very easy to do so. Let's take the most famous scientific project probably of our generation, the decoding of the human genome. Its first director was James Watson, co-Nobel Prize winner with Francis Crick. Its second director, Francis Collins, who's now the director of the National Institute of Health in the United States. Both of these men, top scientists. One an atheist, the other a Christian. That ought to be enough to show you that the issue is not God versus science at all. There is a conflict, a very real conflict, and it barrels up from the ancient world into the academy in Oxford, Stellenbosch, and everywhere else. It's a worldview conflict. It's not science versus religion. It is two fundamentally, diametrically opposed interpretations of ultimate reality. The ancient Greeks, their brilliant atomists like Leucippus and Democritus, decided that ultimate reality was atomic, the things that are atomos, that cannot be cut. And the atoms cascaded through the void, and they produced the galaxies, the stars, the worlds, and ultimately life and consciousness. They were the forerunners of materialism. That is the view that mass energy ultimately is all that exists, and therefore must be, by definition essentially, the ultimate explicator of all we discover. In other words, the foundation of a reductionist interpretation of the universe that reduces everything to physics and chemistry for the simple reason that there is nothing else. But then there was Socrates, my intellectual hero, and Plato and Aristotle and a whole string of other philosophers who said no. Mass energy isn't all that exists. It does exist, but there is transcendence. There is a God, or the gods. There's a God who created the universe and sustains it. So barreling up through the centuries, we have those two worldviews. The one says ultimate reality is essentially physical reality, mass energy. The other says no, ultimate reality is a personal God. And that's where the conflict lies. So the real question, ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me, is not science versus religion. It's where does science fit in determining which of those worldviews is true. Now, I know there is another major worldview, pantheism, which essentially says the universe is God. But in the academy, in the West in particular, it's the two major worldviews of materialism, stroke naturalism, and theism that clash. And so I'm going to concentrate briefly on those today and then open it up for your questions, because that's far more interesting to me and to everybody else. So there's this widespread impression, and it's fueled by people like Richard Dawkins and more recently, Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss. The idea that you, if you want to be taken as intellectually respectable, you've got to choose between science and God. And anyway, you can forget about God because science is ultimately the only way to truth. Now, Servaas, in his introduction, mentioned this thing: do we need other disciplines? Well, if science is the only way to truth, the answer is no, we don't. And you can shut half the faculties in this university straight away, because you won't need history, you won't need literature, you won't need linguistics, you won't need languages, you won't need anything but science. That's nonsensical. But it's important to see why it's nonsensical, because there is a widespread impression that scientism dominates. That is, science is the only way to truth. Now, Bertrand Russell once put it this way. He says, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. Now, Russell was a clever philosopher and a brilliant logician, but his logic departed him completely when he made that statement. What science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. Is that a statement of science? Well, obviously not. So you cannot know it. If it's true, it's false. Isn't that right? Perhaps it's too early in the day for logic like that. It contradicts itself. It's logically coherent. And one of the greatest scientists in Oxford, Sir Peter Medawar, reacting against this, said, look, you do disservice to science by suggesting that it can answer all questions when it's so obvious that it cannot. It cannot even answer the simple questions of a child. Where have I come from? Where am I going to? What is the meaning of life? And Einstein was clever enough, he was clever, wasn't he, to see that, as he put it, you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but not the scientific foundations of ethics. And that's so obvious, isn't it? I mean, ethics, science can tell you that if you put strychnine in your grandmother's tea, it'll give her a very uncomfortable afternoon. In fact, it'll kill her. But science can't tell you whether you ought to do it in order to get your hands on her property. So, well, I'm glad you laughed, because it's so obvious that science is limited. But science and its offspin and technology have been so successful in our culture that although we can see often it's limited, nevertheless, the last word is often given to science. Now, why is it, I ask myself the question, that people like Stephen Hawking, who is just ahead of me in Cambridge and is light years ahead of me in his intelligence, insists that we must choose between science and God? In his recent book with Leonard Mlodinow, The Grand Design, that's what it's all about. Dawkins is the same. Choose between science and God. Well, let me analyze that. It struck me when thinking about it, as I've done for years, that the problem is not necessarily simply a question of a misapprehension of science, although it is that. It starts with a misunderstanding of the nature of God. And that's what drives it, actually. Because, you see, when people say science is against God, the first question you've got to ask is, what do you mean by God? And, of course, they will tell me, as they've told me often enough. They say, Professor Lennox, you believe in a God of the gaps, which, roughly speaking, is, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. You know, the idea of the Greeks, that lightning was the gods being angry. And then people did a bit of atmospheric physics. And they discovered lightning and thunder are not the gods being angry. We can understand the mechanisms involved, air temperatures, electric discharge, and so on. So exit God from that bit. And so God keeps being removed from all these gaps until he finally disappears like the smile on the proverbial Cheshire cat. Now, if you believe in a God of the gaps, of course you have to choose between God and science, because that's the way you define God. It's so obvious when you think about it. Shall I repeat that? Because it's so important in this debate. If your definition of God is something that explains what science has not yet explained, of course you've got to choose between God and science, because that's the way you set up your concept of God. But I have never met an intelligent Jew, Christian, or Muslim who believes in a God like that. We all believe in the God of the Bible, who's the God of the whole show, not the bits we don't understand, but the bits we do understand. He's the God of everything. And so when you get Isaac Newton discovering his law of gravitation, he didn't say, oh, marvelous, now I know how it works, I don't need God. No, what did he do? He wrote the Principia Mathematica, the most brilliant book in the history of science, expressing explicitly the hope that it would lead thinking people to believe in a deity. You see, the more he understood, the more he admired the genius of the God who'd done it that way. And of course that's the way it works, isn't it? If you study engineering here, you'll be much more in a position to admire a turbojet engine than the person who's only studied applied basket weaving. If you study art and literature, you will be more in a position to understand the genius of a Rembrandt or a Picasso than the person who's never done it. In other words, the more you understand, the more you admire genius. So why can't it be the same with God? The more I understand of science, the more I admire the genius of the God that did it that way. That was Newton's position. It's my position. So there's no necessary conflict there at all, for another very simple reason. You see, Newton didn't banish God because he discovered this law of gravitation, because he understood the simple thing that God as an explanation is not the same as science as an explanation. One of the things we need to look at is the nature of explanation. What does it mean to say that science explains? You say, well, we didn't understand the movement of the planets, so we got a law of gravitation, and that explains. What does it explain? Do you think it explains gravity? It doesn't, and Newton knew it didn't. Nobody knows what gravity is. I wish I'd been taught that at school. You see, the law of gravity describes what happens when massive bodies are attracted by each other and they fall towards each other. It doesn't tell you what gravity is. You see, even at the scientific level, we're bamboozled into thinking if you have a scientific explanation, you understand everything. And Wittgenstein put it brilliantly, the great philosopher. He said the major deception of modernism is to think that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature, when they're no such thing. They are simply descriptions that give us very powerful predictive capacity. So this notion that science explains need investigation. But now we put something else against that explanation has different levels. And you may have heard this illustration from me before, but it doesn't change in its power to help people imagine this. We've got a Ford Galaxy here with its engine exposed, and I say to you, let's ask ourselves how we explain this engine. And somebody says, well, I explain it in terms of engineering and the law of internal combustion. We've got a law and a mechanism. Somebody else comes along and says, no, I explain it by saying Henry Ford. Well, are those alternatives? Obviously not. Now, I speak to many children in schools, sixth formers, 400 of them yesterday, and they can instantly see that an explanation in terms of a personal agent, Henry Ford, is in a different category and does not compete with an explanation in terms of law and mechanism, internal combustion and engineering. They can see that. I don't know why Richard Dawkins can't see it. I don't know why these leading scientists cannot see it. That God does not compete as an explanation with the scientific explanation. And it's absurd to think that the God of the Bible competes, because he started science anyway. The essence of every intellectual discipline which you're involved in this university is taxonomy. Giving names to things. You all do it. We all do it. You know words I don't know, and I know a whole lot of words you don't know. Not many if you know anything about subnormal subgroups and arithmeticity. That's all right. We contain things by giving names to them. And one of the fascinating things in the Bible is that God created the universe and he says, you go and name the animals. And we still have millions of species we've never named yet. Taxonomy is still a booming business. Never get the impression that God's against science. He built a brilliant universe. And it's ultimately, for me, intellectually exhilarating to explore it. So God is not against science. But people put these ideas around. They set up false alternatives. I'm going to stop in a minute or two, but I perhaps ought to mention this because it's the heart of the God delusion, that book that Richard Dawkins wrote. He says, look here, even if you accept all that and you can't bring in God as an explanation at any level. Why not? Because by definition, God is more complicated than the thing you're explaining. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? So I said to him, Richard, I pick up a book. It's called The God Delusion. It's quite complicated. It's got about 450 pages. And I asked what its origin is. And I discover its origin is in the infinitely more complicated mind of Richard Dawkins. So I dismissed that as an explanation because that explanation is more complicated than the thing I'm explaining. It's childish logic, but there's a serious side to it. We've been bamboozled, some of us, into thinking that explanation always goes from the simple to the complex. Where did you get that idea from? It actually doesn't come from science, although reducing things from complex to simple is enormously important. It is demanded by naturalistic philosophy. Because there's no transcendence, there's no top-down ultimate intelligent causation, so you must be able to reduce it. I finish with a story, and we'll open it with questions. Story time now. We have a marvellous college in Oxford, candlelit dinners and all that kind of thing. And place names are put on the table, so you can't choose where you sit. So one evening I found myself beside one of the world's leading biochemists. And as people are wont to do in Oxford, they don't ask you who you are, they ask you what you do. So I said, I'm a pure mathematician. Oh dear, he said. How very boring. Well, I said, I admit to it. It's not really sociologically acceptable, my field. It doesn't excite people. So I try to make up for it, by being interested in the big questions. He said, what big questions? Well, I said, one of the things I'm interested in is the status of the universe. Is it created or did it simply happen? And I'm also interested, by the way, in the status of human life. Is it a freak accident? Or are human beings made in the image of God? And if you'd seen his face, he said, it's far worse than I thought. He said, listen, we're going to have an awful evening. I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we've nothing to talk about. And he meant it. Well, that was an interesting start for a dinner party. So I said, I think we're going to have a great evening. He said, are we? I said, yes, I'm absolutely fascinated by reductionism. I know at least 3 kinds. What kind are you? Well, that was a bit difficult, so being a kind Irishman, I helped him out. And I said, I'm a methodological reductionist. When I get a problem, in any discipline, but particularly in mathematics, I divide it up into simpler problems. I study the simpler problems and hope they give me insight on the big problems. Yes, he said, I do that. Well, I said, that's something we could talk about. We're agreed on that. But I said, my suspicion is you're an ontological reductionist. From the Greek word ontos, meaning being, that means you believe, as a postulate, that everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. He said, that's exactly right. Oh, I said, well, why don't we do an experiment then? He said, what? Here at the dinner table? I said, well, where better? We're in Oxford. Let's do it here. So I picked up the menu. And there it said, for all to read, roast chicken. Not even in French. We're not very imaginative. So I pointed out R-O-A-S-T. And he said, what's the experiment? Well, I said, you're a reductionist. And I repeated it. He said, yes. Right, I said, let's have a go at this. Those marks on paper have a semiotic dimension. They carry meaning. So please explain to me the way that happens in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. There's a little silence. His wife was with him, and rather too loudly she said, get out of that if you can. He didn't try. His answer rings with me since, and I've had it from other people. He said it can't be done. He said, for 40 years I've gone into my laboratory, totally convinced it can be done. But he said, I see today it can't be done. I was so shocked that I immediately went over on the other side, and I said, but half a minute. Physics and chemistry, in the modern sense, have only been going about 500 years. He said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's not within the power of physics and chemistry to cope with something that, from its own nature, demands intelligent input. I nearly said to him, you mean an intelligence of the gaps? But I didn't, because I know what he would have said. It's not an intelligence of the gaps. It's a situation that demands an intelligent input. R-O-A-S-T. But the nub comes now when I apply this to some of my colleagues who are delightful molecular biologists. And they take a longer word than R-O-A-S-T. It's the human genome with which I started this lecture. It's 3.5 billion letters long in a 4-letter chemical alphabet, C-G-A-T. And I asked them, well, what about that word, the longest word that's ever been discovered? Oh, they say, origin of that, chance and necessity. What? You mean chance and the laws of nature have produced that? And you see R-O-A-S-T, and you know intuitively that whatever natural processes are involved in putting that on the paper, at the back you're going to find intelligence. Why is it you can do it with a 5-letter word and not with a 3.4 billion letter word? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So, the first questioner asked me for the name of the biochemist. He did not give me the liberty to do that, but I guard that confidence. But I don't need to give you that name, because there's been a book appeared recently by Thomas Nagel, a philosopher of biology. It's called Mind and Cosmos, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the Universe is Almost Certainly False. And the interesting thing is he uses in it essentially the argument I'm using. The point of it, this is just the thin edge of a massive wedge. And the massive wedge is the fact that the physicists are now saying very strongly, this is the information age, it's the digital age. Information is now an essential part of molecular biology. And information is not material. And the argument that Nagel gives is this, that up until now, our physics and our chemistry has not taken on board the fact that we're doing the science with minds that are information processors. And therefore, the point that was simply made and admitted by my biochemist is now being admitted all over the place. And if you like to read, say, the works of Alvin Plantinga on the one side, who's a Christian philosopher, and Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist, people are beginning to realize that there's something down there, that information is an irreducible quantity. So you will understand, sir, that if people don't give me permission to speak in public, then I won't give their name. But that doesn't affect their argument. The truth of an argument is not necessarily governed by the person that uses it. So the second point, often perception of reality can be seen in the development of something. What is the thought process in the mind of God? I haven't a notion. And I don't think anybody has. And I say that quite honestly. These issues of second-guessing God, we can only react to what I believe is revealed to us. Now, let me now say something. Having confessed my ignorance, now let me say something positive. I do believe there's more than nature that we can study with our minds. There is revelation. And revelation is not opposed to reason. That's another false alternative. For instance, the Bible is a revelation from God. I've never met anybody who can read it without using their reason. So to say that revelation and reason are opposed is just a simplistic confusion of categories. Now, what we can glean from early Genesis is not a vast amount, but it is a very important amount. And one of the other questions referred to it, so let me bring that in. That's the value of having a group of questions at once. The fascinating thing is, whatever you believe about the days of Genesis, come to those in a moment, God did not create everything at once. That's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, if God is almighty, he can create everything at once, but he didn't. There was a start, there was a sequence that leads to a goal. That tells you something. It tells you that there's teleology, that there's purposefulness. So back to now your question on a much more modest level. What was in the mind of God? Well, what was in the mind of God, as is revealed to us, is the creation of a physical nature into which he could introduce utterly unique creatures. You and me. Now, we live in a world today where the uniqueness of the human species is being attacked all around, particularly by Peter Singer, whom I debated not long ago in Australia. Human beings, according to the Bible, are made in the image of God. That gives them infinite value and dignity. The universe shows God's glory. It wasn't made in his image. You were. So that's one of the things, actually, one of the reasons I am a Christian. It's because of that valuation that that kind of thinking gives to me as a human being. I don't find it in any other philosophy, incidentally. That doesn't prove it's true, but it doesn't prove it's false. It has to be factored into our thinking. And human beings being made in the image of God as persons are capable of the highest thing in the universe. That is the relationship with the Creator who made them. We'll come back to that in a moment, because we have to look at these two things. Very briefly, the question of the age of the earth and the question of, in one of my debates, I say that evolution is what happened after life. So what about the compatibility between evolution and the biblical record? Now, this is a lecture in its own right. In fact, it's much more than a lecture, which is why, having been asked to lecture on it endlessly, I decided to write a book about it. So here's a bit of shameless advertising. My book, God's Undertaker, A Science Buried God, which is on Kindle and everything else, addresses this question. The emphasis on the fact that evolution doesn't account for the origin of life is simply an antidote to Richard Dawkins having said for years in his book The Blind Watchmaker, for instance, that has such influence, and I quote, that what Darwin discovered is the explanation for the existence and variation in life. He's retracted that, I'm glad to say, in his more recent book on the topic. Evolution depends, whatever it does, it depends on the existence of a mutating replicator, and therefore logically it cannot be used to explain the existence of a mutating replicator. So the origin of life is utterly separate, and of course, since it involves the origin of digital information, and information is of interest to the mathematicians, it comes much closer at home to me. And that is why I've spent much more space on it than I spent on evolutionary theory. The other reason is I'm not a biologist, but I read as much biology as I can. I go to biology seminars, and I interact with some of the leading people in that kind of field. I'm only going to say two very brief things. Is evolution compatible with the biblical record? Is a different question from is evolution compatible with theism? That it's compatible with theism ought to be obvious, because there are many, many people from the very beginning who, like Asa Gray, who was Darwin's champion in North America, were believers in God and accepted evolution. So the fact that they are regarded by many people as compatible should be obvious. And I think it's worth pointing out that evolution is a biological theorem. Theism is a worldview. Atheism is a worldview. You cannot deduce a worldview from biology. And you see, you listened without a murmur, which was very nice, when I said that Newton, when he discovered a mechanism and a law of gravity, he didn't dismiss God. And at the heart of that kind of argument is this notion that the existence of a mechanism that does something is not in itself an argument against the existence of an intelligence that designed the mechanism. You got that? Well, you can apply that to mutation and natural selection. I mean, the fact that mutation and natural selection do something ought to be obvious as you look around this room. We all look different. And that's because there's quite a bit of selecting has gone on. It might even be going on during this lecture, but that's another matter. And certainly mutations have affected us. There is clearly, and Darwin saw it, life is a plastic thing. It fills niches. There are all kinds of variations. Now, going aside from the theism, I certainly can't see that you can deduce atheism from this. But I have real questions of the science of the matter. Can this mechanism that clearly can account for some variation, can it produce new information? And I'm very skeptical of that for reasons that I've published. But my theism doesn't depend on it. So those are a couple of points, but I have written extensively on it. The age of the earth, well, now I must make a confession. I think I was introduced as coming from Northern Ireland. It's much more serious than that, sir. I come from the city of Armagh, which had a famous archbishop called Ussher. And he wrote a letter to the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University saying his calculations showed that Adam was born at 9 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday the 5th of October 4004 BC. Dear sir, I'm sorry I cannot make the matter more precise. So that young earth notion. So what are we going to do with it? Well, again, I get asked this question endlessly. So I decided to write another book about it, which has just come out recently. It's called 7 Days That Divide the World. But you asked about the age of the earth. It's worth pointing out, of course, that the age of the universe, the age of the earth, the age of humanity are three different things, and they're constantly confused. But let's take the one you asked about. How old is the earth? And of course, there'd be no problem if the Bible said nothing about it. But what does the Bible say about it? It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And when was that? Well, you say it talks about a sequence of days. Yes, it does. But if you've got any literary sense in you, you will see that each of the days from 2 on begin, and God said, and God said, and God said, and God said. And the presumption is that day 1 also begins with and God said. If that is the case, then in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is not on day 1. And the Hebrew makes it very clear anyway, that the statement in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is completely independent in its tense from the sequence that follows. So when did it occur? The Bible doesn't say, and so I don't. So I've no difficulty with thinking that the scientists may well be right, that it occurred a number of billion years ago in the case of the earth and the universe. Ladies and gentlemen, I use this as an example to show that it's not taking the Bible seriously that leads people to a young earth. It's perhaps because they don't take it seriously enough. I take it very seriously, and that's why I say, no matter what you believe about those days, you cannot argue the age of the earth from the days. Now, what do the days mean? Oh, you say a day means 24 hours. No. In the text of Genesis 1, the word day has 4 meanings. That's news to a lot of people. And what are those 4 meanings? I'm not going to tell you. If you're interested, you can follow it for yourselves and have a look and perhaps find my book useful. All I want to argue is this. I understand people very well because I'm one of them who's passionate as a scientist and also passionate about my commitment to the authority and inspiration of Scripture. I find one doesn't need to make compromise in either direction. But that's something we need to discuss, and we need a whole lecture on it, and I can only give little approaches to these things rather than give it in detail. So I've tried to write as sympathetically as possible on this topic. Now, the final of the 5, there was one, how do I explain the geographical spread of different religions? Well, I presume the geographical spread is explained by where their founders were born. That's one of the reasons. But I suspect that behind that question lies a deeper question. That we face all these different kinds of religions in the world. And how do we cope with them? This is linked to the other question, which was, how do you make the leap from the existence of an intelligent creator to a personal God of Christianity? It's the same kind of question. And it's a very important question. Even more important is the way we approach it. I have friends in all religions and none. I respect them deeply because of where I sit as a Christian. Where do I sit as a Christian? I believe that you, whatever you believe, are a human being made in the image of God, and you've got infinite value. I believe even more than that. I believe that God has created us as moral beings. And that's why as you look around the world, whatever religion or non-religion, you will discover a basic moral ethical core. C.S. Lewis wrote about it in his brilliant book in 1940, The Abolition of Man, but it's been picked up many, many times. How fascinating that wherever you go, you will find the so-called golden rule. You'll find it in Roman pagan religion, you'll find it in every contemporary religion, you'll find it in the statement of the British Humanist Society, you'll find it everywhere. Why is that? Well, from where I sit, it's because each one of us, whether we believe in God or not, is a moral being. Now, that being so, I admit as a Christian that my atheist friends and my friends of other religions can put me to shame in their moral and ethical behavior. Now, once we establish that respect, we can talk about differences. Of course we can. It's only the atheists that get worried about people talking about religious differences. I have the slightest difficulty about talking about them for a very simple reason. Because leave Christianity out of it. No Muslim will agree with a Hindu that there are hundreds of millions of gods. The fact is, religions differ, and most of the representatives of them I've ever met are very happy to discuss their differences. Come down to the 3 great monotheistic religions, because you asked me the question why it is I take the stand I do. Well, let's test this. My Muslim friends tell me that Jesus never died. My Jewish friends, of whom I have many, tell me that Jesus died but never rose. And I tell them Jesus both died and rose. We can't all 3 be right. Now that ought to be obvious. So how do you decide it? And that was your question. How do you decide to take the stance you do? Well, I know no other way, ladies and gentlemen, but by considering the evidence. That's the only way I know. And the evidence is cumulative. What does history have to say about the death and resurrection of Jesus? Oh, but, and here comes Dawkins' voice in the back of my ear. I've got a direct line to him, you know, and he keeps whispering in my ear, you're talking to these people about the supernatural. How absurd. David Hume has shown that's impossible. Nonsense, he hasn't. That's why I've written another book. Well, you wanted an answer to the question. My latest Gunning for God has a chapter devoted to analysing the resurrection through the eyes of David Hume's criticisms and giving my reasons why I believe that Jesus, as a matter of history, rose from the dead. So that's an objective side of it that helps me decide the matter. The person who asks, how do you make the leap between? Use the word leap. Into that word leap, I wouldn't use the word leap. I would call it a step. Because just as I feel there's evidence in the natural universe for an intelligent God, Mainly in what I haven't even mentioned today, that is the very fact we can do science. The rational intelligibility of the universe speaks to me about a rational creator. And now we come down to history. Christianity claims to be geared into history. But there's a third side, that is the subjective side. And Christ claims that he has the capacity to forgive me and give me a new life and a relationship with God. Well, what's all that about? Very mysterious to some people. But now here is the point where you've got to give up your distance. You see, if you want ever to get to know me as a person, you have to give up your distance and start revealing a bit of yourself to me, and vice versa. And God has revealed himself, I believe, to us in Christ. And so, and this will sound awfully lame and you'll psychologize it out of existence, but then it's both sides, it's objective and subjective. All I can say to that last bit is that I find that through my life increasingly, as I committed more and more deeply to Christ as Lord and Savior, I find it works. It transforms marriage. It transforms lives. It transforms friendship. That's part of the evidence, ladies and gentlemen. It's serious evidence. Because after all, if Christ claims that he can give people new life and you see no evidence of it, forget it. So all of these things, for me, add up together to cumulative evidence. And so that's how I take that step. That's a very personal thing. He asked me a personal question, so I've given you a personal answer. Perhaps I should have asked you not to listen while I answered it, but there we are. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am now under serious threat by this clock. I've been told to stop at 1:55. It is 1:55. Thank you very much.